So we'll kick off the afternoon session. Enjoying your fish pond. Okay, y'all grab your rod and reels, let's go. No, I think there's some technical information that's going to be shared. Our next speaker, Bence Carter, works with the Alabama Cooperative Extension System, which is part of Auburn University, and he is the Forestry, Wildlife, and Natural Resource Agent for 10 counties in the Wiregrass area for the last 7 years. His primary office is in the Wiregrass Research Extension Center in Headland, Alabama. Bence is responsible for providing technical assistance to stakeholders in the areas of natural resource management, as well as developing research-based educational programming to help better their lives. Bence is a good friend of mine, and he's doing a great job. Look forward to hearing what you got to say, Bence.
All right. Thank you, Tim. Appreciate y'all waiting around for the afternoon session. I like to think y'all are really vested in your pond. Y'all may just be waiting for the accountant that's right after me, so I don't know. But hopefully, going through these slides, there's a lot to cover in the 20-25 minutes that we've got about recreational fish ponds. And what I wanted to outline is looking at kind of as I'll meet with landowners, what are some of the problems that I see with ponds, or maybe some of the issues that they have with their ponds. And then hopefully at the very end, there may be some questions as well too. So I want you to think about your recreational fish pond is looking at it like a garden. And thinking about the steps, how you manage your garden. You want to make sure that you build it correctly. You want to make sure that you amend the soil correctly. And then at the end of the day, you get to harvest. And looking at that same concept with a recreational fish pond is very make things a lot simpler. So when it comes to pond maintenance, when that pond was created, it was built with very steep banks. 1 to 2, 1 to 3 foot ratio, dropping off really fast, where you only had less than 20% of the pond that was under 3 or 4 feet. And that was designed that way really to help control weeds. Because one of the things, the biggest issues that happens when ponds are left alone, as the banks start to sediment in, those provide places for weeds to grow. So looking at your pond, looking at the banks, is it something that over time those banks have begun to shallow up? And maybe are you having weed problems in there? So they may be thinking into consideration, hey, I need to come in there and deepen up those edges of the banks to help prevent some kind of weed issue that I might have. Also grass on the banks. And a lot of times when ponds have been left alone, you start to see trees starting to collect on the banks. And that's one of the worst things that can happen when they collect on those dams. Not as much that those roots are going to penetrate the core of those dams, but think about when we have a heavy windstorm. We've got a lot of severe storms come through Alabama. As those trees are pushed over, that root ball turns over with the tree, exposing the dam, causing some potential structural issues with the dam. So any kind of tree that's less than about 6 or 7 inches, DBH, which is a forestry term, 4.5 feet up, it's worth cutting those down, treating them with an aquatic-based water-soluble herbicide to make sure that those trees don't resprout from those stumps. The next thing, looking at your water control system. And that's important to really preserve the integrity of that dam. A lot of times, or that pond was originally built probably to NRCS standards, had a standpipe went down, elbowed, and went through the dam. And on top of that standpipe was a trash rack. After years, heavy rains, the trash rack may begin to rot away and disappear. It exposes the top of your standpipe. So mud, dirt, sticks, beavers may build stuff on top of that, can cause structural integrity issues. So it's worth replacing that trash rack to help prevent debris from getting down into that standpipe and clogging it up and causing another issue. If it gets clogged up, a lot of times landowners will establish what we call a siphon system, is another way to allow water to drain out of the dam without having to dig out the dam, replace the standpipe, and put a new one in. Other thing, looking at your emergency spillway as well too. That's the last resort. If that standpipe's not handling all that water, emergency spillway is designed to direct water away from your dam and preserve the integrity of it. So it's very important to either have those concreted, which is really costly, I get that. So grassed to make sure that it's not any kind of erosion or very limit the erosion. Also resist trying to put some type of swing set or riprap or something in there as that's another way to slow up that water trying to leave that pond that's already beginning to overfull in a high rain event. Next thing, looking into, we amend our gardens, we amend the soil. The waters of our ponds are the same way. And now, depending on where you are in the part of the state, you may have issues with low alkalinity or low hardness in your pond water. You think about the water is sitting on those soils, so those soils are going to take on the properties, the water is going to take on the properties of the soils that it's sitting on. Down here, we have a real heavy sandy loam, clay loam, or sandy clay, very acidic soils. So in turn, we've got to bring or amend our fish ponds by liming them to bring up that alkalinity and hardness to balance out that pH just like we would in our gardens. As you're in the Black Belt region of the state, we don't really have any issues with acidic soils. The soil types there typically don't need to be limed, so the same way with the fish pond. You get up in northern parts of the state, you start to see areas where those soils are going to encourage those fish ponds to need to be limed. But it's worth getting your water tested every few years by your county extension office, and they can look at that alkalinity and hardness to determine if that pond needs to be limed to help balance out that pH. So when it comes to pond liming, how do they do that? And really, there's two different areas. What you're trying to do is you're trying to get as much broadcast over the entire pond as possible. If your pond has pretty accessible banks where you might be able to back a spreader truck up to, project it out into the pond, then that's acceptable. But the idea is to try to get as much coverage as possible. So a lot of times folks will end up using some type of liming barge. And as you can see right there, it's not a real sophisticated type of boat. A lot of times it's a pontoon boat where they've knocked the sides off of it. They'll load the lime off, wash it off with a water cannon as they're moving around the pond to try to get as much coverage as possible. Looking to do that late fall is mainly because we have less rain during the late fall. So there's less chances of you putting several tons of lime into a pond than it washing out with a heavy rainstorm. So drier times of the year, fall is going to be your ideal time. And looking at the frequency, how often to do it. And just like pulling a soil sample for your fields, your food plots, your gardens, you may need to lime it every year in some situations. It may be scenarios where you lime it every 2 or 3 years. Now, one thing with fish ponds, liming is a compounding effect. So a lot of times if you lime it 2 or 3 years pretty repetitively, then you might be able to extend that period of being able to when you don't have to, or extend the time period between lime applications on that pond. Other things to consider, muddy water and high water flow. Muddy water, as you dump a lot of lime into the pond, that's a way that we can use to clear up muddy water or heavy silted water. So what happens if you're liming your pond trying to boost that alkalinity and hardness when it's muddy, that lime's going to bind to those silt particles, those clay particles, and sink down to the bottom of the pond. So you're not going to have that good effect. Same way with high water, a lot of water flushing through your standpipe, it's just not going to get that sustained effect. So very important to try to avoid those times. And then other times, when it comes to liming your ponds, old or just typical ag lime, dolomitic ag lime is going to be ideal. And when we're looking at liming rates, we're looking at liming at tons per acre. So it's a lot of product that's going into the ponds. But there's other lime products out there, but they all have their application, and a lot of times it's not for utilizing in your recreational fish pond. Pelletized lime, they bind it with a clay particle. What happens is that usually sinks down to the bottom and doesn't get that release that what you would see like you're using it in a food plot, you're using it in your yard. Hydrated lime, a really high concentrated sense of or formulation of lime, it's not going to get the sustained effect, and even it's extremely corrosive as well too. And then liquid lime, there's a lot of manufacturers that are starting to come out with that liquid lime for fish ponds, and the physics just doesn't matching up with it. You're thinking about we're liming fish ponds at tons per acre. And a lot of the manufacturers that are using liquid lime are saying 1 gallon of liquid lime is worth 1 ton of agricultural lime. The science doesn't add up on that one. So, and what you end up seeing is you don't get a sustained effect when it comes to using a liquid lime product. It's a very short-lived product. So by the time you're dumping gallon after gallon after gallon of liquid lime to try to balance out that alkalinity and hardness, it would have been cheaper just to go with an ag lime application to it. Next thing, fertilization. So fertilization is one of those things that it's going to be based on landowner preference. And before you make that decision to fertilize your fish pond, you need to know the pros and the cons of it. Just like fertilizing your garden, you're going to boost the productivity of it. And you're going to see the same thing in your fish pond as well too. So to kind of give you some numbers, a fish pond that's not fertilized is going to produce about 100 pounds of fish per acre per year. When you fertilize that, you're going to triple, quadruple that productivity of that pond. So with that, just like a garden, comes the responsibility of having to harvest fish out of the pond. So if you're going to make that commitment to fertilizing your pond, also make the commitment that you're going to have to harvest fish at the end of the day as well too. And I'll show some slides in a minute of what happens when you don't harvest the fish. Other benefits, because what you're doing when you fertilize your pond, everybody's seen a pond in the middle of the summertime that has a pea green color to it, kind of an OD green color to it. That's the plankton that's growing, or the phytoplankton that's growing in that pond. So, and it's a plant, so when you fertilize it, you're causing more of them to grow. And it has a lot of benefits. It's the bottom of the food chain, so that's where we're increasing the productivity of the fish in the pond. It's also going to be the main source of oxygen in the pond as well too. So it's a plant, it's going through photosynthesis and converting carbon dioxide to oxygen. And then also it goes back to how we constructed the pond with the banks dropping off real quickly. We're fertilizing it, we're turning that water green. It's going to prevent sunlight from getting down to the bottom and having a potential weed issue in the pond. So a lot of benefits to that, but you got to know the end game of the more responsibility of you're going to have to harvest more fish as well. Where in fields, lawns, things like that, nitrogen's a limiting factor. Typically, you don't see that in ponds. New ponds may need a dose of nitrogen, but typically phosphorus is going to be the limiting nutrient. So any kind of pond fertilizer is going to have a really high middle number, that phosphorus number. So looking at formulations and when to apply. So the goal is to begin fertilizing that pond when it comes out of dormancy. So the magic number with ponds is kind of around 60 degrees water temperature. So when that water temperature hits 60 degrees and sustains, it's when it's time to start fertilizing your pond. When does that happen in Alabama? Sometimes in December, sometimes in February, sometimes in April. So, but looking at your water temperature is going to be the gauge of when that pond starts coming back out of dormancy and it's to begin to start fertilizing, because also at the bottom, if you're not keeping sunlight out, weeds are going to start growing in the bottom of the pond. So start fertilizing when that temperature hits 60 degrees. So I said earlier, pond formulations have a heavy middle number. That phosphorus element is really, really high. So that's one to look at. And then looking at the type of formulation and how simple you want to be when it comes to adding it into your pond. Granular has been around a long time. You're talking about 40 pounds typically per acre of granular herbicide. Either dissolving in water. A lot of times if you've got a designated area where water's flowing into the pond, you can sit it on a stand or on the bottom of the pond, cut the bag open, and let the natural water properties dissolve the fertilizer. Liquid fertilizer is another option. Usually you're looking at about a gallon per acre, and that's even more simple. You're trolling around your pond in your boat, dumping it in the back, letting the props dissolve it in the water. Another potential option. And then finally, the water-soluble powder is one of the easiest ones. You're talking about 5 pounds of a water-soluble powder that you walk around, take a scoop, and throw it in the edge of the pond. So depending on how simple you want to use, how to go, is really which formulation that you want to use. But again, when it comes to buying a pond fertilizer, looking for that middle number with a high phosphorus amount is going to be very, very important. Just like liming the pond, avoid high water flow so it's not going to flush out. Also avoid times where the water's real muddy, because it's going to, those fertilizer particles are going to bind to that muddy water and not release. And then also water hardness. So just like plants needing lime to be able to make that fertilizer more accessible to them, same way to that phytoplankton. So water hardness, if the pond needs to be limed or not, is going to be one of the big drivers of how long of an effect it's going to take when you fertilize that pond. How do we measure fertilization? What you're seeing in the video on the screen, he's using a Secchi disc. And you can buy one of these commercially made. You can make one on your own. Really, it's a disc that has, it's divided into 4 quadrants, white and black quadrants. And the technique on this is he's lowering it down into the water, and we're measuring how far that disc disappears. So ideally, we want it to disappear between 18 and 24 inches, which tells us that we've got enough fertilization in that pond, that we've done our job. So based on if the disc disappears too soon, less than 18 inches, the fertilization is too much. If it's more than 24 inches, you're not seeing that sustained effect of the fertilizer, so it's worth at least adding another half dose to see if you can get that bloom up on that pond. Alternatives to fertilizer, so if you don't want to have them to worry about that increased harvest, is pond dyes. Now keep in effect that you're going to reduce that productivity, but pond dyes work really, really well to help shade out that sunlight from getting down to the bottom of the pond and causing that nuisance vegetation from growing. There's a reason golf courses use pond dyes, and they come in a variety of different colors. Black, green, blue. You could probably find red or purple if you wanted to. But again, the goal there is to use it in lieu of fertilization to help prevent weeds from growing in the bottom of that pond and interacting with your fishing. So now we're getting to the fun part that Tim was talking about, fish composition. So when that pond was typically stocked, more than likely, it was probably stocked with a combination of bass, bluegill. And that combination was actually developed at Auburn, Dr. Swingle, because the bass keep the bluegill population in check, or the brim population in check, and in turn, the brim or the bluegill are going to reproduce numerous times throughout the year to provide forage for the bass. The two of those balance each other out, so it's a very, very good combination. So most pond owners, their goal is for what we call a balanced pond. And what we mean by balanced simply is overall good fishing. You've got a lot of different size classes of fish, and that the fish are healthy. There's enough food for the bass, and the bluegill are getting, the populations are being kept in check by the bass. So a lot of times you end up with 2 to 5 pound bass in your pond and bluegill that are 6 to 8 inches. For most pond owners, that's a fun day of fishing, and good eating size for fishing as well too. So how do we keep it that way? And we go into the maintaining the populations through harvest rates. So harvesting bass at the end of the day is going to be very important. There's nothing there that's going to keep those bass populations in check outside of us angling fish out of the pond. So depending on if you're fertilizing or not, 10 to 25 pounds of fish per acre per year is going to be a good harvest mark for largemouth bass. When it comes to bluegill, you're not going to over harvest them. The bass are keeping them in check. You can go several hundred pounds of bluegill per acre per year. Other fish that you may see in the ponds, shellcracker get put in a lot. They don't reproduce enough to be able to sustain an entire bass population. Channel catfish, crappie is one that gets thrown in ponds quite frequently, but they start to compete with bass and bluegill in really, really small ponds. So it's not typically advisable anything less than 10 acres. And then hybrid brim are a lot of times thrown in ponds by themselves, or maybe with a few largemouth bass or catfish to help keep their population or their minimal reproduction in check. Other things to look at when it comes to aquatic plant control, grass carp, really, really good at controlling some underwater vegetation, not everything. So depending on stocking rates, just as a preventative or maintenance, it's good to have 5 or so in a pond. Before you reach that 25 per acre, talk with a fisheries professional to see if it's going to do the job for you. Tilapia can provide a little bit extra forage for your bass, but they work really, really well on filamentous algae, duckweed, some of the real small plants. Downside with tilapia, when the water temperature dips below 60 degrees in the wintertime, they stop eating and they die off. So typically they have to be restocked every year. So closing up here, the main issues that we see with ponds is plants growing in the pond. And that's going to impede our recreational benefit or our enjoyment of the pond. So it's important to catch them early, get them identified, either through your county extension office, Alabama Freshwater Fisheries, get them identified and start working on a management plan for it. Most all of us have one of these in our pockets, can take really, really good pictures of plants that are growing in the pond, get them sent off to the professional to get identified and start that management plan. Because when it comes to control, what options do we have? Ideally, that cultural control, preventing it from growing, nice steep banks, fertilizing or dyeing the pond to help prevent it from growing, but we're going to miss it every now and then. So looking at what other options. Raking, typically not. Still leaves root systems plus plants are 90% water. Very, very heavy, very difficult. Looking at biological control, grass carp, tilapia. You know, again, they don't eat everything, and they're not going to clean up a pond in a growing season. So they're not the perfect solution. And then lastly, chemical control. There are pond-approved herbicides that are safe to use in your pond, but again, you're still introducing a foreign chemical into the water, just like using it in your lawn or something else. And even then, it's not the perfect fix to where it's going to eliminate the problem forever. It's really setting that clock back to zero in order to be able to prevent it from occurring in the future. And if you have a pond, you're always going to have weed issues, but knowing it, to identifying it early, and then being able to jump on it and address the issue to set that clock back to zero so you can begin preventing it. Lastly, closing up here, just a couple of fish enhancements that can be used anywhere from fish attractors to pellets in gravel beds. You know, the take home with what your goal is to put them in areas and flag them so you can be able to use those as fishing opportunities. So within casting distance of a bank, or even maybe potentially flagging them so you know where to focus on your angling efforts. And then supplemental feeding, again, you're increasing the productivity of that pond. So if you're going to supplementally feed, know it's going to come with increased harvest rates. Or you may just like to feed your fish for the enjoyment out of it. But a good rule of thumb is don't exceed about 5 or 10 pounds of feed per acre per day, which is a lot of feed. Or look at what they would consume in about 5 or 10 minutes. But just know what you're going to be getting into by adding that additional productivity into the pond by supplementally feeding those fish. And your grass carp too. If you've got grass carp in a pond, they're going to go after the supplemental feed as well too. So it may limit the potential impact that they have. So just a couple of additional resources that we had. I know that was a 20-minute crash course in recreational pond management. But I do think they're going to share these slides with everybody as well as the recordings. Here's my contact information on the board. Even if I'm not in your region, feel free to use me as a resource. I'm happy to help. So, thank y'all.